shorter version of the bios than the version that's outside. Just give you a scope of what we hope to cover tonight. Turn the program over to the co-moderator, also with the Animal Law Committee, Alexis, Saba, and then we'll each speaker will be have independent time. And you could see one of our speakers is participating from Minnesota. Okay, so let me just say, this is, as you know, a very broad topic. It's so broad that, one might even want to talk about pesticides in the context of marijuana, and those are the people upstairs who are in the marijuana program, and that's why they're not here, downstairs. So it's a very broad topic, and clearly there's no way that we could, cover the topic in one evening. So this is a little smattering of what we think, touches the high points. So we are going to address agricultural pesticides tonight. We're not going to be touching on commercial consumer products for household cleaning or for lawn care. We won't be talking about pesticides used in other contexts, like on golf courses. Just so you know, we've had this program in the works for a little bit of time. It came about because pesticides and their adverse effects from the impacts on pollinators, which you've probably read about, bees, bats, butterflies, the impact on birds, the impact to human health and to the environment generally, have been really high profile in the news. At least for those of us who follow those issues, I get something or many things every day in my email on the issue. And it raises the question of how pesticides work and why those that are known to have adverse impacts are actually still in use, at least here in the United States. This panel is a general discussion of what agricultural pesticides are, how they're used, health and environmental impacts, how they're regulated, and what sort of advocacy is occurring to address the impacts. As you walked in, you noticed that there are two handouts. We thought it'd be a good idea because there are complaints in two different lawsuits, so you get to see some of what are the alleged facts, and it frames the legal causes of action that are the kinds of causes of action that litigators are bringing in connection with pesticide use. So one of them is the complaint in the lawsuit against Monsanto involving the alleged unlawful promotion, marketing, and sale of various Roundup products, which is the pesticide that contains the active ingredient glyphosate. And the other handout outside is the complaint in the NRDC case against the EPA in connection with neonics on threatened and endangered species such as the rusty-patched bumblebee, the black-capped vireo, and the San Bruno elfin butterfly. So that's outside. So let me just introduce the speakers, and our first speaker is Dr. Doug Gurian-Sherman. He is our scientist for the evening. He joins us, as I said, from Minneapolis. Doug is a research consultant with Strategic Expansion and Training, LLC, focused on supporting ecologically based sustainable agriculture, food sovereignty, and food equity. He was senior scientist at the Food and Environment Program of the Union of Concerned Scientists from 2006 through 2014. He's written numerous research reports and papers on pesticides, genetic engineering, livestock and climate, and agroecology. Dr. Sherman has also served as an expert witness in lawsuits on GMOs and pesticides. He was a scientist at the US EPA responsible for assessing human health and environmental risks from transgenic plants and microorganisms and developing biotechnology policy. Jeanine Broughel. I knew I wouldn't get it right, okay. But I had, it's a 50-50 chance. Jeanine is the chief of Pesticide Product Registration Section of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. She's an environmental chemist with the New York State Department, DEC, and has a Bachelor of Science degree from the State University of New York at Albany. She's currently the chief of the Pesticide Product Registration Section, and she will be talking to us about pesticide registration, of course. She started with the DEC in 1990 in the product registration program, and over the last 28 years, Jeanine has handled all types of pesticide registration activities and issues.
Yeah, you don't have to read it all.
I'm not going to do the whole thing. So now we're going to move on to Peter Lehner, who's the Senior Strategic Advisor at Earthjustice. Based in New York, Peter Lehner directs Earthjustice's Sustainable Food and Farming Program, developing strategies to reduce health, environmental and climate harms from production of our food and to promote a more environmentally sound agricultural system. From 2007 to 2015, Peter was the Executive Director of the NRDC and the NRDC Action Fund. From 1999 to 2006, a little earlier, Peter served as Chief of the Environmental Protection Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's Office. He previously served at NRDC for 5 years directing the Clean Water Program, where he brought important attention to stormwater pollution. And that is also an abbreviated version of his bio. And finally, we have Kim Richman, who's the founding partner of the Richman Law Group here in New York. Kim is a public interest litigator. Through an activist approach to law and policy, Kim endeavors to clean our adulterated food systems of contaminants ranging from trans fat and GMOs to synthetic ingredients and pesticides. Most recently, Kim's mission-driven client base of consumers, NGOs, and progressive businesses is focused on eradicating glyphosate from oats, wheat, honey, tea, and other food products, as well as tackling factory farming practices that threaten animal welfare, the environment, and human health. So with that, we won't have to separately identify folks, and we're going to start them in that order. Does this work for you folks?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to turn the meeting over now to Alexis.
So we'll have about 15 minutes for each panelist to give an introduction focused on their various areas of expertise and to kind of lay the groundwork for more free-flowing conversation, and then have time for audience Q&A at the end. So we'll just get started with Doug.
Okay, this is the official talking head. First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I agree this really is an important topic, something I guess all of us on the panel spend a lot of our careers working on. So what I'm going to do is basically cover some of the basic questions about the science of pesticides. Why do we use them? What are some of the primary pesticides we use in the U.S.? How do they affect potentially our health through exposure, impacts on the environment? How are they studied? What is the evidence of harm? What are some of the uncertainties, or are there uncertainties that make it difficult to regulate these chemicals? And I also want to talk a little bit about the context of why we use pesticides, and especially in the context of potential alternatives, because part of the way, a big part of the regulation of pesticides is under FIFRA, which is ostensibly a risk-benefit statute. And so, to that extent, and especially in some aspects of the regulation of pesticides, the benefits do weigh in determining the use of pesticides, and certainly in terms of the political arena, the necessity or need for pesticides argued by farmers and the companies that sell them is a major part of why we use pesticides. So I'll get into that a little bit, because I do think it's a really important context for framing the whole discussion about why we use them and what their risks are and so forth. So starting with what are pesticides, why we use them, most simply, they are substances that control or mitigate pests. And as was said earlier, we're talking here about agricultural pests. They are also regulated for residential use and all of that, but we'll focus here on agriculture, which really are, I guess, the largest use overall of pesticides. Basically, there are several types of chemicals that are broken down into categories of the types of pests they control. So herbicides control weeds, insecticides control insects and other related organisms like mites and slugs and so forth. Fungicides control fungi. and rodenticides, control rodents. So there are these various classes. The main ones that we're usually talking about in agriculture are herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. Herbicides by volume are the most widely used pesticides now. Some people, and I should say that in common vernacular, some people don't think of herbicides as pesticides, but they are pesticides, they're legally pesticides, and in terms of impacts potentially on both human health and the environment, they are justifiably regulated as pesticides. So herbicides are part of the mix here. So you're familiar with chemicals like DDT, for example, historically, and that's one of the synthetic insecticides. I'll also note that there are other substances that I won't get into very much here, but are also important and are regulated as pesticides. So, for example, in genetic engineering, when we put a substance into a plant that is expressed through a gene that controls pests, that is regulated as a pesticide. I was involved in some of the history of how those regulations were developed, and initially EPA was going to call them just plant pesticides. The industry and some of the scientists in my field, I'm a plant pathologist, strongly objected. They wanted to distinguish those from chemical pesticides, so the agency came up with a compromise language, it's called the PIPS, which sounds much nicer, but it stands for Plant Incorporated Protectants, which the industry and others thought sounded less threatening. They wanted to make this distinction between chemical and pesticides. There are also natural pesticides that are also regulated that can be used in organic agriculture that might be extracted from plants or naturally occurring compounds. I'm not going to talk much about, I'm not going to talk about those at all either, but it's good to know that they're out there kind of as part of the mix. And there's also microbes that can be used as potentially as pesticides. And they're usually acceptable in organic agriculture, but they can also and are also sometimes used in conventional agriculture. So why do we use them? Well, I mean, the simplest answer is to reduce losses from all of the pests that I was talking about on our crops. And those pests, if uncontrolled, can cause losses typically in the range of 20% or more, and if there are bad infestations of these pests, sometimes whole crops can be lost. And that really also depends a lot on environmental conditions and how the crops are grown, which I do want to talk about a little bit. So that's the kind of accepted reason for why we use pesticides, but in the context of how we grow our crops, another reason I would argue is really tangential to that, which is issues such as labor saving or efficiency, and not simply a matter of protecting productivity. And as a matter of fact, if we leave organic aside and talk about the amounts of pesticides that are used, there's quite a bit of research now that shows that using what we call agroecology or ecological principles to grow our crops greatly reduces the need for pesticides and actually can produce higher productivity. And so it's important to understand that there are these different alternatives, and this will come into play a little bit more when I talk about that as a topic a little bit later on. But just as a couple examples, we can control probably the most serious pest of corn, which is our most widely grown crop, using genetic engineering or pesticides that are applied in the soil, or pesticides or insecticides that are coated onto seed, neonicotinoids that were mentioned earlier. But we can also control them simply by rotating crops, corn and soybeans. And actually probably 60% of farmers do that because it's generally more productive. You can really avoid the use of insecticides virtually entirely. There are some biological exceptions that I won't get into, but essentially crop rotation, which is a good and well accepted practice, can essentially avoid the need for the use of insecticides for controlling rootworm, and yet it used to be called the billion-dollar pest because the cost of controlling it could cost as much as $1 billion in insecticides. And why farmers choose to use one approach or another is again, an important topic that needs to be understood as such. We can use plowing, for example, to control weeds. That has some downsides in terms of soil erosion. We can use genetics, either genetic engineering or just conventional breeding to develop resistance to pests, especially pathogens. And so there are different, usually in most cases, there are actually different options. And it's, again, important to keep in mind that that is the case and that that pesticides are primarily used and the volume that we use is used because of the type of agriculture system we have decided to embrace. And a lot of that really, I think, it's beyond what we can talk about here. It has to do with the corporate context that this is developed in, the products that the companies want to sell to the farmers, and the ways that these can, in some ways, make life simpler, at least in the short term, for farmers. So again, that's, I think, a very important context to understand. One of those, so what are some of the primary herbicides? I'm going to focus on two that were already mentioned. One is glyphosate, or more generically Roundup, produced, it's off patent, so it's produced by a lot of companies, but it's associated with Monsanto. And I think it really illustrates the growing dependence on pesticides and that dependence that goes along with the kind of industrial agriculture that we have decided to embrace here. Again, not because it's the most productive, but because it is in some ways defined more efficient. It's in some ways saves labor, allows farms to grow larger, and there's a whole kind of feedback loop in terms of farm size and the need for efficiencies and relying on things like pesticides that really is, I would argue, a vicious circle, also encouraged by farm bill policies that subsidize some of these crops, which again is something that is beyond what we can talk about here. But one illustration of that is this nexus between the seed companies and the pesticide companies. So Monsanto, for example, produces the traits that are most widely, one of the main companies, one of the handful of companies that produces the engineered traits that are widely grown, one of which is herbicide resistance. So we've made our cotton, corn, soybeans, canola resistant to this herbicide that previously could not have been applied to the crops or would have killed them. But now, as a matter of convenience, it's applied on top of the crops that made resistant to this herbicide, and the herbicide still kills the weeds. What that has resulted in is a tremendous increase in the use of that herbicide, the reliance on that herbicide, and herbicides overall. So before these crops came into effect, we used about 30 million pounds of glyphosate a year in the U.S. We now use over 300 million pounds per year, so a tenfold increase. And the overall amount of herbicide we are using now is higher than it used to be. And that has been due, again, to this type of agriculture that we've developed that is highly dependent on pesticides. What has happened with these crops is it's resulted in weeds that have developed resistance to glyphosate, something that scientists have called for a long time the pesticide treadmill, which leads to the use of more herbicide, other herbicides to counteract the resistant weeds, and the resulting increase in the use of herbicides. A consequence of that to the environment has been the destruction of the only plant that monarch butterflies, the iconic monarch butterflies, use as food, and they get milkweeds. And so the main breeding area, we killed off most of the milkweeds through the use of glyphosate, which has resulted largely in about a 90% decrease in the population of monarch butterflies. There are some other reasons probably why that has occurred, but I think it's pretty clear at this point through a lot of research that the loss of milkweeds is the primary reason for that. In terms of insecticides, one of the primary, the most widely used insecticides now are the neonicotinoids. Ironically, when they were introduced, it was the intention was to replace other widely used classes of insecticides, the organophosphates, which are notorious neurotoxins, and synthetic pyrethroids, which are also neurotoxins, but not as nearly as toxic to humans as the OPs. What we have found is that, ironically, these neonics are extremely toxic to lots of organisms that are beneficial to both farming and the environment. So again, they're associated with the decline of bees and other pollinators, but they're also, these insecticides are highly water soluble, so they get into our water and they're associated with impacts on small aquatic organisms that are the food chain for fish and birds and frogs and amphibians and so forth. Ironically, they also harm the natural enemies of pests that all farmers, including conventional farmers, rely on to keep pest levels low. So there's a number of studies. I think the classic one is where slugs, which are largely immune to these insecticides, would eat the seeds and eat the soybeans, accumulate the insecticide in the body, and then the important predators that would keep the slugs in check, called ground beetles, which are susceptible to neonics, would eat the slugs and die. And what it was found in Pennsylvania through some really well-done studies is that the productivity in soybeans was actually reduced by 5% when neonicotinoid seed coatings were used compared to no use of insecticides at all. So, there can be these background consequences that I think are very important. How are people in the environment exposed? Very briefly, through the air, basically water and consumption in our diets. That affects both the environment and humans. And I think, here we have to make some distinctions, which probably other panelists will get into, between exposure to farmers and farm workers, which are under the worker protection standards, which are somewhat different than the dietary standards, which are EPA uses under FIFRA, but are basically codified under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and are basically a higher standard of reduction of harm, of avoidance of harm than for workers and for the environment. So all of those, again, drift when pesticides are sprayed. They can drift, they can go through the soil and get into our water supply. They can be picked up, as I noted before, by other organisms and then eaten by other organisms. So all of these mechanisms come into play. Another major question that I was asked to address is how are pesticides studied? And there are basically two routes that this is done for. One is for registration of pesticides, in which there are specific range of studies that are required. So you've probably heard about using rodents as a stand-in for humans. Rodents can be fed the pesticide and then studied to see what kind of effects that might have. Similarly, for the environment, there are surrogate organisms, bees, earthworms, critters called Daphnia in the water, certain fish and so forth that are stand-in organisms for the rest of the environment. The studies for humans also include what we call in vitro studies. There's one famous one called the Ames test, where we study bacteria to see if pesticides might be mutagenic or carcinogenic. More recently, starting from 1996, when the Food Quality Protection Act came in, it was mandated that EPA use what's called endocrine disruption. So that's basically hormones disrupting our hormone system. So, one important is breast cancer, for example, disrupting the hormones involved in regulating those systems can lead to breast cancer. So that's another. A lot of those are done in the laboratory or in vitro. I think an important aspect of this that gets into the next aspect of what are some of the uncertainties and challenges is that these are very complex systems. And so using rodents as a stand-in for humans, we know that there's not a perfect correspondence, as you might expect, between rodents and human beings, so that the agencies build in what they call safety of 10 up to about 1,000-fold of a reduction in allowed exposure to try to take that uncertainty into account. And it's a very imperfect system, as are the other tests. So one thing we also have, which EPA unfortunately doesn't rely on very much, is epidemiology, which you're all familiar with, for heart fat and heart health and tobacco effects and leading to cancer and so forth. In other words, following human populations, trying to take into account other factors that might lead to disease and trying to single out or tease out the effect in this case of pesticides. But it's important, again, I think, to distinguish, although there are weaknesses in the human health aspects, there are even greater weaknesses in the environment because the study there tends to focus mostly on whether a pesticide and at what levels will kill certain of these indicator species in the laboratory. And that really, without getting into the details, really does not well represent what happens in the field. And what we've discovered in the last 10 or 20 years is, one, those indicator species are not very adequate because other species may be much more sensitive, or less sensitive, but often much more sensitive to those particular pesticides. And secondly, what we call sublethal effects, can be as or more important than lethality. So what we found, for example, with neonics and bees is that at very, very low concentrations, in what we call the low parts per billion, or even somewhat less, you can have effects on bee immune systems, so they're more susceptible to pathogens. You can have disorienting effects. Some of you may be familiar with the dance of bees. Bees will teach each other where to go and how to forage. That can be disrupted by very low concentrations of these pesticides. Grooming to get rid of parasites can be affected. And all of these things, reproductive health, all of these things can be, as or more effective, but are harder to study. And once a pesticide is registered, it really becomes problematic because trying to tease out all of these effects gets to be very challenging. And that's where I think the final question I was asked addresses the uncertainties come in. Given the complexity, both the human health and the environment, you really need or hope to have several different lines of evidence. And because you could potentially have different things affecting the health of bees or the health of other pollinators or whatever, or humans, the industry will often try to argue that those other factors are as or more important. And finally, so that gets to how do we then decide what is safe and what isn't. And that's a decision, a social decision really, or it should be a social decision. How much risk should we accept versus the benefit that these pesticides are supposed to provide? And that leads me back to where I started in part, and I'll finish up with the value of other forms of cropping systems and farming to protect our environment, not only from pesticides, but it turns out, and there's a lot more and more evidence of this, more and more research that shows this, that you grow crops using principles of ecology that bring in diversity into farming systems that will provide as or higher productivity, more resilience to things like climate change than conventional agriculture, is more sustainable because it preserves the soil, can be more sustainable during drought because healthy soil holds more water for plants to use. And so there are these synergistic values of producing our food in using ecological principles that either reduces or eliminates the need for pesticides. And this again has been shown over and over again. But I think finally the problem there is that the industry that profits from the production of these pesticides wants to be able to sell these products. And these means of doing farming through ecological means, what we call agroecology or some call regenerative, reduces the need for these products, whether they're fertilizers or pesticides. And so they're inherently going to be threatening to these companies that are making profit off of this. And those companies heavily lobby our government, heavily lobby EPA. When I was there, we would see representatives from Monsanto and others in the door virtually every day talking to our directors and so forth. Again, I think that context is really important to keep in mind when the other panelists talk about the regulations, that we do have alternatives. They're not nearly as heavily invested in. They would take adjustments. They're somewhat more labor intensive, but they're quite doable and quite scalable. So I'll leave it there, and again, thank you for your attention.
Great, thanks so much, Doug. So we'll have Jeanine. Do you want to sit here?
Sure.
So we can go through your program.
Okay, I'm going to kind of go through this quickly. A lot of this stuff is going to overlap, but I regulate pesticides. I'm not for pesticides. I'm not against pesticides. A lot of the things that he said is terrific, and we work with Cornell on a lot of like IPM, integrated pest management strategies, and I think we should be moving to a lot of this stuff. But I regulate pesticides. That's my job. I'm Switzerland, right? I don't care. It doesn't matter. It's just if you're going to use them right. So let's see here. Briefly, they already said what a pesticide is. Anything for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating pests, and also plant regulators, defoliants, and desiccants are also pesticides. And a definition of a pest is something that's living that you don't want to be living anymore, pretty much. Insects, mice, microorganisms. We register a lot of disinfectants. So people say, I don't use pesticides. You probably do. If you use bleach that says it disinfects, you're using a pesticide, and we register that. A pesticide product is a specific combination of ingredients packaged and labeled for a particular use. EPA registers active ingredients only in conjunction with specific labeling. So when people say, oh, the active ingredient's registered, well, it's not registered by itself. It has to be registered in a certain format. And registrants submit their applications for registration of those specific products, and they have to do data for it. I'll get into that in a little bit. And then we have our labeling.